Hello and welcome back to another episode of the Film Nerd Podcast. This is episode 11. I'm Vince, and today I am going at this solo. I've had guests on for many of the recent episodes. Episode 3, I did do a solo one, and today I'm going to go at it solo in the intention of starting a new end of the month series. For those of you who have followed some of the things I've posted on Instagram and Facebook and Letterboxd over the last 5 or 6 years in terms of reviews, I greatly appreciate the time you've taken to read a lot of those. Moving forward, I probably will not be doing that anymore. My plans going forward will be to, at the end of the month, kind of give a recap and my thoughts on everything I've been watching, in a succinct as possible episode here on the Film Nerd Podcast. It's just going to be a much easier way for me to talk about movies without being have the constraints that come with using social media to post those reviews. I'd rather talk about them in video format. So hopefully that doesn't disappoint people who have taken the time, which again, thank you so much for reading those over the years. And I've gotten positive feedback, which I've always appreciated. And I've always been humbled by, as I did not expect as many people to read them and enjoy reading them as have. So anyway, again, every month at the end of the month, I plan on doing a little recap of everything I've watched, old and new. And I will keep it kind of sectioned off into first new films, in this case films that have been released in 2020, and I did manage to watch one film in 2021, followed by any TV and miniseries shows, and then lastly some old films that haven't been released within the last year or two. I will be giving my thoughts on those as well. If you would like to skip ahead to any certain point, I will have the timestamps in the description on the video on YouTube, or this description on any podcast store that you are listening to this on. So before we get started here talking about a few movies, I would also like to mention that moving forward, in addition to doing these end of the month reviews where I talk about everything I've watched, I will continue to do the discussions with guests. I actually have a couple discussions coming up here. I have a discussion that I will be doing on Zack Snyder's Justice League in a couple days, as well as hopefully next week doing a discussion with a guest on Godzilla versus Kong. So I will continue to do those as frequently as I can when I find time to do them. I also have plans to do a monthly, or possibly twice a month, a game that I'm excited about on the channel. So we'll see when that comes to fruition, hopefully very soon here. And then lastly, as part of this monthly series, I am starting a new challenge for myself that will be an ongoing challenge over the course of a couple years. So I will talk about that near the end of this episode. So anyway, without further ado, I'm going to go ahead and get started talking about some things that I've seen this month, giving my brief thoughts here, trying to keep this as succinct as possible. If at any point, obviously, you'd like to skip ahead to something that you want to hear about, all of the timestamps will be in the description of the video, as well as the description of the episode on any podcast store you are listening to. All right, so without further ado, we're going to go ahead and get started here talking about what I've watched this month. So first off, I did at the beginning of the month watch and review Nomadland, Feels Good Man, Judas and the Black Messiah, and Cherry. Not going to talk about any of those formally, as I did do previous episodes on all of them. So if you want my thoughts, extended, elaborated thoughts on any of those films, check out those episodes. So the first film I want to talk about here is a 2020 film, horror film called Spree. Spree stars Joe Keery, who is best known for his performance in Stranger Things, as Kurt Kunkel, a rideshare driver who is obsessed with becoming an influencer and attempting to do whatever he can to become viral, to go viral on the internet, and basically embraces a rampage as a rideshare driver in order to go viral. This film is pretty wild. I hadn't heard anyone talking about it. I didn't even have it on my radar until a student of mine suggested it to me. and it is on Hulu, I believe. It's probably one of the best character study films of 2020. It's not going to be for everyone. It's very bombastic and kind of over the top, very surreal exploration of internet culture, influencers. So if you don't like that kind of stuff, you might not enjoy it. However, it's really trying to satirize some of those things while taking it and throwing it into a serial killer kind of horror thriller, almost black comedy concept. It doesn't really feel like it often has much to say on some of these issues that it's exploring in terms of internet addiction, and that egotistical aspect that comes with social media and the internet, how shallow the internet culture is. But I feel like that is kind of the point, right? While the film is shallow, so is what it's studying. If anything, this film is absolutely worth checking out for Joe Keery's performance. It's probably one of the best character study films and performances of 2020, to be honest, and no one's really talking about it. It's probably going to end up being a guilty pleasure for my 2020 list, which I'm hoping will be out soon. So Spree, definitely check that one out. Next new film I did a rewatch on. It is the film Possessor. Possessor comes from Brandon Cronenberg, who is the son of David Cronenberg, very famous body horror filmmaker, who has done a lot of great stuff over the years. So the film is about Tasia Voss, who is a corporate assassin. So this is like a science fiction horror film. Basically, she assassinates high-profile targets by possessing the body of individuals. This film is absolutely insane. It is one of my favorite films of the year. It is going to be very high on my list. I enjoyed this one a lot, and I would highly recommend checking it out. I don't know if it's for everyone. I could imagine people being turned off by the extreme blood and gore, but I think it has a very distinct vision. It's a beautiful film in terms of its cinematography and presentation, but it is at times very difficult to watch. It has a very eerie score, great tone, atmosphere, great practical effects, some very bizarre and interesting visuals, use of color, and again some brutal violence and some extreme use of gore, with some pretty solid performances. Characters aren't really anything quite that memorable, but I would definitely recommend checking this out if you're a fan of horror, especially science fiction horror, body horror. This is one of the absolute best in terms of horror films to come out this past year, and I would definitely recommend checking it out. The next film that I want to talk about here is a Beastie Boys story, directed by Spike Jonze. This is a fascinating film. So it is a live documentary. It was done as a collaboration between Spike Jonze and the two living members of the rap group Beastie Boys, Mike Diamond and Adam Horovitz. Obviously, MCA has passed away, and that is definitely talked about in the documentary, of cancer quite a while ago. So they actually did a performance. They toured this live documentary where they go to an auditorium and basically kind of like a stand-up live visual presentation performance. The two come out with mics, and Spike Jonze is directing from backstage, or up in the quote unquote press box. I don't know if you call it that in the office or whatever in the auditorium, but he's directing visuals that are on screen behind him, and music and videos, images, while they basically tell their story. Now, it's not quite exhaustive of the Beastie Boys by any means. The final 20 to 30 minutes kind of rush through the final decades of the band. It's really the initial hour to 80 minutes that goes pretty in depth, but it's a very straightforward documentary. It's not super flashy. It's very simple, because again, it's kind of a live performance that's just filmed and presented in the documentary format. But this film just connected with me. This documentary just, I fell in love with it. I'm not some Beastie Boys fanboy. I enjoy the Beastie Boys. I've enjoyed their music. A lot of this, if you're a big fan of the band, you probably know most of this stuff. I was aware of quite a bit of the stuff that's talked about, but there's something about listening to them tell their own story, accompanied with Spike Jonze's direction, which again is very simple because they're just presenting this from an auditorium. But they make some interesting and simple, subtle choices that I couldn't not love this. I don't know. I just fell in love with this documentary. It just did a lot of things for me that worked, and I enjoyed every moment of it. I got completely wrapped up in this entire documentary, and I would definitely recommend checking it out. One of my favorite documentaries that I saw from 2020. It's available currently on Apple TV. I guess I should continue to tell you guys where these are available. Possessor, the previous film that I mentioned, I believe is currently available on Hulu, if I'm not mistaken. So moving on to my next one here, we have The Mole Agent. The Mole Agent is another 2020 documentary. It is a Chilean documentary. So I am a Spanish teacher. I enjoyed watching a film that was in Spanish. So this is obviously being Chilean. The entire thing is presented in the Spanish language. Everyone's speaking Spanish. So basically, this documentary details an agency, a kind of, I don't know if you want to call it a spy agency, but a private investigator, I guess would be the best thing to call it, is hired to come in to this retirement home in Chile when a daughter is suspicious of her mother being not being treated well, maybe, even having things stolen from her. So the private investigator has to hire an elderly person. They hire an 83-year-old man who has recently lost his wife and looking for, something to give his life a little bit more purpose. So he is hired to be this mole agent, private eye spy in this retirement home. So it's a very simple premise, but very interesting. The thing that I love most about this is the man, Sergio, who is hired to do this. He is such a sweet, loving, beautiful human being because he genuinely cares about all of the people in this home, and he keeps getting distracted from his assignment and wants to become friends and involved with the lives of many of the residents. And what happens by the end of this documentary is the woman who you never even see, who hires this private investigator, her and her mom and her mom's plight aren't even really the focus by the end. Without spoiling anything, basically by the end, the entire purpose of the documentary is kind of an exploration of elderly people being abandoned by their families and not appreciated, and trying to find your purpose in life at a point in your life where it's kind of coming to an end. It ends up exploring some of these very poignant and beautiful and even heartbreaking themes that by the end left me in tears. I mean, there's a few really powerful moments at the end of this documentary that are so beautiful. It's very simple in its presentation. It doesn't do anything super fancy, but it is well made, it's well presented, and it's very engaging, very fast paced. And The Mole Agent, definitely worth your time. It's an excellent Chilean documentary that came out in 2020. My next film is another documentary. Excuse me, I keep forgetting to do this. The Mole Agent can be found on Hulu. Last I knew, this next documentary also can be found on Hulu. The Painter and the Thief. So The Painter and the Thief is another documentary film that came out in 2020. It takes place in Oslo, Norway, and it is one of the most fascinating premises for a documentary. And it's kind of amazing that this got made. You got to give credit to the director, Benjamin Ree. So basically, two paintings from an incredibly popular and talented artist in Norway. Two of her most valuable paintings. Her name's Barbara. They're stolen from one of her galleries in Oslo. And they find both thieves who stole them pretty quickly. But they were so high. They were so messed up on drugs that they legitimately don't know where the paintings went, what they did with them when they were stoned. And the one thief she befriends. She goes to the trial hoping to find clues, and ends up becoming friends with the thief through asking to paint him. She wants to paint a portrait of him. And it just starts this unusual friendship. And most of the film explores the next 3 years, the story of this artist looking for her painting while becoming friends with and developing a relationship with this thief and kind of using him for art. So the setup is beautiful. It's tragic. It's fascinating. I mean, I was invested from the get-go. The final act of this film, the final 40 minutes or so, kind of loses itself, at least what I wanted out of it. Instead of focusing as much on the relationship between the main character and the thief, which was what was so fascinating to me, this unlikely bond between these two, they kind of step away from that and focus more on her plight to find the painting, which is fine. Obviously, that's a part of the documentary as well. But it kind of brought the film, the documentary, to not necessarily a halt, but I started losing interest in the third act. So this is definitely a documentary that's worth checking out. It's going to be on my 2020 list for best of the year films, but it is one that kind of, again, doesn't quite complete the journey that I was looking for, that I wanted on it, but it's still definitely worth your time. This documentary, just like The Mole Agent, I believe is also still on Hulu. The next film I'm going to talk about here very briefly, because I didn't really enjoy this one very much, is the film, not a documentary, it's a film, Kajillionaire. So Kajillionaire is from Miranda July, and I do not believe I've seen any of her other works just yet. Now, this was a film that I decided to check out because it had been receiving a lot of praise on social media, in the film Twitter sphere, and I'd seen a lot of buzz in terms of the indie community, is this being kind of an indie darling or a very popular, smaller film. It stars Evan Rachel Wood. Richard Jenkins is the dad. Evan Rachel Wood plays the daughter. And so basically Kajillionaire is about two con artists who have basically spent 26 years raising their daughter to also be a con artist. So you have this family of three, 26-year-old daughter, middle-aged parents, pushing 60s, and they're basically stealing and scamming to survive. So it's a very interesting concept, especially for a heist film, because the film as it goes along ends up being about one major heist. The problem is I just didn't care about any of the characters in this film. I really wanted to love this, especially because I'd heard so much praise for it, and there's a lot to appreciate. It's a well-made film, a lot of interesting visuals, interesting direction, obviously a really bizarre concept and take on the heist film genre. But I don't know. I was just expecting so much more. This film, at the end of the day, really just didn't connect it with me. And it does explore some interesting themes and ideas. And again, it's got some interesting visuals and some really bizarre things it does. But this one just did not connect with me, unfortunately. I mean, it's one I would recommend checking out if you're looking for a different independent film. But it's unfortunately probably not going to make my end of the year list. And it sadly did not connect with me. Kajillionaire I rented on VOD. I do not believe it is playing on any major streaming service at this time. The next film that I absolutely have to recommend, and it's going to be on my 2021 list. I'm again still working on my 2020 list, but this is a 2021 release. It is The White Tiger, which was recently nominated for an Oscar for best original screenplay, adapted screenplay. I think it was adapted screenplay because it is based on a book, I do believe. The White Tiger is currently on Netflix, and basically it's kind of, I wouldn't necessarily label it an epic, but it's just this long sprawling journey of this Indian driver who uses his wit and his charm and cunning to basically go from the very poor, impoverished, lower class, all the way trying to rise to the top of the ranks and become the master of his domain, to try and become a businessman and wealthy. And it is based on a popular book as well. I love this movie. I mean, it's funny, it's dark, it's this kind of dark crime thriller with a good sense of humor that's sprinkled throughout. I've seen people compare it to a far more grounded truer to India's culture version of Slumdog Millionaire. Slumdog Millionaire was a Hollywood, rags to riches story of an Indian individual. And this film is kind of similar, rags to riches story, but kind of explores some of the gritty, less Hollywood version of that. It's got great direction. It's very colorful, visually interesting. It's a unique perspective, solid performances, has humor, has serious drama as well. There's very heavy narration throughout this film. I wasn't always on board with the film's narration. I did enjoy it, but I think it should have been a little bit more subtle, a little bit more restrained. And the ending does feel a bit hollow. You're kind of left feeling a little bit empty by the end. But I still think this is absolutely an excellent film that's worth checking out. I really enjoyed it. It's going to be high on my 2021 list. So The White Tiger, currently on Netflix. The next film that I want to talk about is another documentary. It is also on Netflix, and it was recently nominated for Best Documentary Film for 2020 at the Oscars, called My Octopus Teacher. Oh man, guys, I absolutely loved this documentary. I'm going to tell everyone, I'm going to praise this film to everyone that I can. It is absolutely stunning. I had not heard of this film till it was nominated for an Oscar. So essentially, this guy, Craig Foster, who lives in South Africa, has kind of lost his zest for life. He was a filmmaker in his younger days, and he's kind of lost his desire to make films, to go out and film. He's a documentarian, and then he decides to do this very interesting experiment. When he's swimming, he decides to start swimming again, as he had done in his youth in the kelp forests off the coast of South Africa. And what he decides to do is go into the kelp forest, and he just decides to start filming, exploring. Well, he meets this octopus in the wild, and he's intrigued by it. So he decides to start this experiment where basically every day for a year, he's going to go back and visit her and see if he can develop a relationship. It is absolutely amazing what ends up happening. He does end up developing this intimate, unbelievable relationship with this octopus. And what I've described this film basically to people, like if you've ever watched Planet Earth, Planet Earth will sometimes do these like anecdotal moments on some of the animals, like they'll turn into a story. Imagine basically take one of those anecdotal moments from Planet Earth and turn it into a feature-length film or documentary. I mean, it's that well shot, it's that well made. I mean, it's absolutely stunning, some of the shots that they get to film, the help that he had on this to film some of these scenes. It's just breathtaking. It's a very impressive documentary, and the music is great. The ending was emotionally impactful. I really enjoyed this, and I feel like not a lot of people are talking about it, not enough people are watching it. So My Octopus Teacher on Netflix, gotta check it out. The next film that I watched is currently on HBO Max, I believe, was where I watched it. It's called Deerskin. It is a French film, and it is weird. It is weird as hell. It's very short. It's only about 80 minutes, and basically it's a man obsessed with owning a deerskin jacket. And he basically is tired of living in, the suburbs, and decides to blow his life savings and turn to crime, while simultaneously, desiring to be the only person in the world who wears a jacket. It's really weird. It's so bizarre. Just the absurdity of this film and its premise alone, this guy who turns to crime to, wear a deerskin jacket and be the only one to wear a jacket, is worth watching alone. And it's only 80 minutes. It's super short. But I felt like it was still kind of vanilla, if that makes sense. Very tame. It had this very bizarre premise, and I feel like it didn't go even bizarre enough. As bizarre as it is, I felt like it should have gone even further with some of the concepts and ideas. It's just that at 80 minutes, there's not a lot you can explore with such a weird idea in 80 minutes. The performances from, I believe, the main character, the actor, his name is Jean, and then Adele, who plays the woman, the supporting character who kind of gets involved with him at the hotel he's staying at, in terms of helping him with his project, that he's doing this crime project that he's calling a documentary, and it's just so weird. But the actress Adele, I don't even know how to say her last name. She was in Portrait of a Lady on Fire. She's brilliant in that, and she's pretty good in this. Really weird, quirky score. It's funny, it's weird, it's creepy, it's simple, it's a quick watch. Probably going to go on my honorable mentions of 2020. Definitely worth checking out. And I believe, like I said, it's on HBO Max currently. The next film I watched, I'm not going to talk much about because I wasn't really a big fan of it, but George Clooney's science fiction, The Midnight Sky, that he directed and starred in. And I believe it's based on a book. This film is so derivative. It's visually striking, has a lot of cool visuals. It's not poorly made in terms of its technical aspects, but it's just so dull. I feel like it's elements of The Martian, The Thing, Interstellar, The Last of Us, The Road. I could probably find a few other films it's so obviously taking from, and it just wraps it up into a film that doesn't really do anything interesting with any of the influences it's so clearly pulling from. And I don't know if you can fault the book equally for that, because it's based on a book, if I remember correctly. But yeah, I unfortunately was very bored with this film. Again, it's not a bad movie, it's very average. It's on Netflix, The Midnight Sky. Check it out if you want to. I wasn't big on it. The next two films are a couple more 2020 documentary films. The first one, Welcome to Chechnya, I believe is on HBO Max currently. I can't believe I've never heard of the atrocities detailed in this film. So living in the United States, news of Chechnya, or even, some of these countries around the world that have things like this going on, or just horrible things in general, don't tend to make it into American news, because here we're so narrow-minded, we're so patriotic, and obsessed with things going on here, with our president and with the, various other things going on here. So you don't ever see a lot of the stuff unless you look into it. But basically, it's a documentary about how in Chechnya, they were basically persecuting people who are LGBTQ, literally torturing them and killing them. And it was kind of, swept under the rug. It was something that, in Russia, it wasn't really getting out. And so this documentary is somewhat investigative, kind of follows the group that is trying to save these people from persecution, abuse, torture, murder. I mean, it's pretty disgusting, some of the atrocities that are detailed in this film. Some of it's really hard to watch, just as they're confronting some of this evil and trying to get them out. The horrors perpetrated, again, are abhorrent. They're disgusting. And it's a story that I think needs to get out. People need to know about it. That being said, talking about it from a filmmaking standpoint, I hate analyzing and being critical of these types of films, because, again, that's not really the point. But in terms of a filmmaking perspective, while it is worth your time, the overall structure, focus, and presentation is not something that makes me want to go out and watch it again. While it is well made, and I get the point, and I think it is an important story, it's just not something I would sit down and go out of my way to watch again. I think it's worth watching once. I think it's an important documentary, but it's not a pleasant watch by any means. And to keep it simple, they're not doing anything fancy with the filmmaking, because that's not the point, if that makes sense. So Welcome to Chechnya, again, I believe that one was on HBO Max. The next film I want to talk about is a similar situation in terms of rewatchability. It's another documentary. It is called Collective. So Collective is about the aftermath of a tragic fire in a Romanian club. Where basically during a concert, I believe it was 2014 or 2015, people were burned alive after an accident during a heavy metal concert at this club. And basically the documentary kind of follows the fallout and the aftermath in terms of the poor healthcare system in Romania, how bad it is, and how poorly these people are taken care of. And basically these journalists uncover this corruption in the healthcare system, the state institution, all of these horrible things going on, in terms of, people getting paid, greasing palms, propaganda, again, corruption, manipulation, all these horrible things that people, really weren't privy to or were not, exposing. The first 2/3 of this are riveting. I couldn't look away. The final act gets very, unfortunately, again, like Welcome to Chechnya, I know it's not the point. The filmmaking qualities are good, but they're not, something I would go out of my way to watch again. It's worth watching once. But the third act does kind of lose steam. They spend a lot of time at the end talking in rooms, people discussing, medical jargon, healthcare jargon. They move away from some of the experiences, the anecdotal evidence and stories and the tragedies and the investigation that was heavy in the first 2/3. That final third is just a lot of talking, a lot of people just talking to each other in rooms. And because this film is not in English, you're caught up reading subtitles as you're trying to pay attention, which there's nothing inherently wrong with that. I enjoy foreign films. I watch a lot of them. But when it's just people talking about some of this, literally documents they're reading off of to each other in a room, it starts to lose your interest pretty quickly. This is still worth checking out. It's a very good documentary. I believe it was also nominated for an Oscar for Best Documentary. Again, I believe that one is on Hulu, if I'm not mistaken. I believe you can find Collective on Hulu. A couple more new films to talk about here. The next one I want to talk about is a South Korean horror thriller film that also not a lot of people are talking about, and it is going to be high on my 2020 list. It is called The Call. Basically, this woman is in her home, and she has lost her cell phone. She has misplaced her cell phone. I believe it's stolen at the beginning of the movie. And so she finds this cordless house phone in her home that starts ringing, and she is connected to a young girl who lived in the same home 20 years in the past. So it explores kind of time loops and jumping back and forth through time. And basically the woman that she's talking to on the phone that lived in her house, that's in her house at the same time as her, but 20 years previously, ends up becoming a serial killer and basically starts doing these horrible things in the past that start changing the future. Now, when you get into things like this butterfly effect, time loop exploration, you could pick it apart for days in terms of plot holes and digging into it, trying to explain some of this stuff. Fortunately, the film moves so quickly, it doesn't leave you much time to stop and kind of think about some of these things or worry about them or pick them apart. It's very entertaining. It's tension filled, it's suspenseful, it's exciting, lots of thrills, lots of really shocking moments, surprising moments as well. Great performances, just a very unique concept that, again, I understand you could pick apart. But I think almost every year I find a great South Korean film. I don't know if I'd call this a great one. It's a very good one that I enjoyed a lot. It is on Netflix. So South Korean horror thriller film, The Call, on Netflix. Absolutely have to check it out. It will be high on my 2020 list. The next film, that is a Chinese language film. It's in Mandarin, but I believe it's a Taiwanese production, is also on Netflix. It is called A Son, another film that nobody is talking about. I saw someone else's review for this, and it was the only reason I checked it out. This is like an epic family drama crime film. It is over 2.5 hours, and it basically is a family of 4 that gets broken apart under some unexpected tragedy, basically that befalls their son, which kind of a play. It's A Son, S-U-N. It kind of, even though that the film is in Chinese, Mandarin Chinese, the title is kind of a play on words, because A Son takes effect in the film in 2 different ways: the sun in the sky, and S-O-N, father son type deal. This is an excellent movie. It is also going to be high on my 2020 list. Again, it's this sprawling family drama, but that's told through this small scale crime story. It has a lot on its mind in terms of family structure. Takes time with its characters, brings you along this 5-6 year journey over 2.5 hours. I enjoyed the runtime. Some people might be turned off by it. It allows time for it to breathe and kind of explore some things. It's beautiful. It's tragic, unique story and perspective. Again, just like I've seen a lot of great South Korean films in recent years, this is a great Chinese language film, even though I think it's technically a Taiwanese production. This is one that's absolutely worth checking out. It will be high on my 2020 list. Really enjoyed A Son. Again, it's on Netflix. The last new film that I want to talk about is another 2021 film. It just came out on Netflix. It is called Bad Trip, and it is from Mr. Eric Andre. It is a prank film in kind of the same vein as Jackass. Now, I know Eric Andre is not for everyone. When my wife and I started watching this, she walked out without spoiling anything, there's a gorilla stunt that's pretty disgusting that she walked out after that part. But if you're someone who can appreciate, Jackass and Eric Andre, it's basically a brainchild of those two things, while also being wrapped up into a narrative. It's a buddy road trip comedy film. And the kind of the craziest thing is it manages to be a satire of those types of films while also being a social commentary on how people react to some of these crazy things that happen, how they choose to help or not help people in that regard. It's absurd, it's disgusting, it's shocking, it's hilarious. I was crying, laughing. It's kind of amazing, again, how they thread together this, comedy film, using pranks to thread it together, while also making fun of this genre and kind of, commenting on how some people act in some of these situations. It's a really good film. It's probably going to be high on my 2021 list next year when I finish films at the end of this year, but definitely got to check it out. Very, very good movie. The last new film I watched that I'm not going to talk about right now because I'm talking about it soon with some guests in my podcast. I did manage to watch Zack Snyder's Justice League, but I am going to save that for a conversation on my podcast coming up very soon here. So look forward to that very soon. Okay, so the last couple things I want to talk about here is very quickly going to run through a few TV shows, miniseries that I've been watching, as well as some old films, and then we're going to wrap things up from there. I did watch WandaVision this last month. Unfortunately, I did not love WandaVision. I did talk about it in a few episodes of my podcast. I was kind of disappointed that they didn't. That they set up a very weird show and then they ended up basically reverting back to the Marvel formula. It's well made. It's fine. It's entertaining. Didn't love it. My wife and I watched True Detective season 1 this month. My wife had never seen True Detective season 1. If you've never seen True Detective season 1, it is 8 episodes of some of the best fictional crime television show you will ever see in your life. I adore season 1 of True Detective. The next thing I watched this month in terms of TV was Devs. Devs is a mini series from Alex Garland. If that name's familiar, he is the genius behind 2 recent science fiction films that are 2 of my favorite science fiction films ever, Ex Machina and Annihilation. So he got money from the same producers that helped him make those films to go over to FX and make an 8-episode mini series. Now, I am very conflicted on this miniseries. I wrote a review of it on Letterboxd. Basically, it's about this computer engineer, Lily Chan, who starts investigating the secret development division, devs, of her employer that's played by Nick Offerman. It's this tech company in San Francisco, and she believes they're behind some sinister things after her boyfriend is murdered by them. It happens in the first episode. It's not a spoiler. It's a setup for the show. Now, I don't want to spend too much time talking about this. I love Annihilation. I love Ex Machina. Legitimately 2 of my favorite science fiction films I've ever seen. I'm very conflicted on this show because it brought back the same cinematographer, same composers. I mean, it has great music, just like his 2 films. Great cinematography, just like his 2 films that I mentioned, because it's all the same people. It's a beautiful film, or beautiful miniseries. Great atmosphere. Great visuals, interesting concept, but it ends up not having any characters. I enjoyed 6.5 hours of watching this, and I just could not get into any of the characters. I'll leave my review up on the screen on the video, and if you want to check it out. I don't really want to talk about it too much more because I did kind of voice my thoughts on this on Letterboxd. But Devs, it's on Hulu. It's an FX miniseries. If you like weird science fiction stuff, if you like the Ex Machina Annihilation, check it out. But I think it's a little too complex, a little too weird, a little too emotionally distant, maybe for the average person to check out. Next, I watched Archer. I rewatched all of Archer, including the recent season 11. I absolutely adore Archer. I think it's one of the best adult animated shows on television. I would put it up there with the very best of the best. Even after 11 seasons, tragically, Jessica Walter just passed away. Very sad, as she is one of the best voice actresses on that show. She voices the main character's mother, who is also the leader, in charge of their detective agency, if you've ever watched Archer. So I'll be interested to see where they go from here. Season 11 seemed like they were starting to push forward some arcs with the characters after taking a very interesting departure from the main ideas of the show in the previous 3 seasons. But it's definitely worth checking out. I love Archer. I think it's great. I am currently rewatching It's Always Sunny in Philadelphia, which I did put a review on. I watched it for the first time every season, every episode last year during quarantine. So I did put a review out for that already. I'm just rewatching it because I love this show so much. I'm very excited that they do have some more seasons coming out. I don't know when. I'm hoping later this year. But It's Always Sunny in Philadelphia. Archer's on Hulu. It's Always Sunny is on Hulu. Great shows. I really enjoy them both. Last thing I want to do before we wrap things up is I'm going to talk about a few older films that I did watch this month, starting with a film with John Wayne, one of John Wayne's earliest films. And the only reason I watched this was because my father-in-law let me borrow his DVD box set of John Wayne films. It is called Blue Steel from 1934. It's pretty bad. It's not a very good movie. It is a low-budget movie. 1930s low-budget movies pale in comparison to low budget movies these days. So it's interesting for an early John Wayne film. I think he's in his 20s in the film, but it's not a very good movie. I watched another John Wayne film that is one of his more famous, more popular films, in The Searchers from 1956. It is on HBO Max. I really enjoyed this one a lot, actually. It has a lot of great action set pieces for the 1950s, a lot of stuff shot on location. It looks pretty good for a 1950s film, Western film. I wasn't huge on the characters, wasn't huge on the dialogue. That was kind of hit or miss for me. I think Stagecoach from the same director, John Ford, is a superior film, even though I believe Stagecoach is older. But The Searchers, solid John Wayne Western film. The next film that I watched that came from the 1970s is also on HBO Max, and that is Assault on Precinct 13, an early John Carpenter film. Again, 1976, very gritty, raw, low budget film, but a well done low budget film with a simple concept. Some really crazy violent action scenes. Execution is pretty spectacular, considering the budget. Not much in the way of characters and dialogue, but that's not really the point. Not sure if I'd rush out to see this one again, but Assault on Precinct 13, first time watch. I did enjoy it. Next, I showed my dad the 1976 film Taxi Driver. He had never seen it. Taxi Driver is one of my favorite films of all time, often considered one of the greatest films ever made. I love Taxi Driver. And the next film I watched is Little Miss Sunshine from 2006. This was a film that I did see when it came out. I would have been like 13 or 14 when this came out. And I remember not really appreciating it. I saw it probably in high school when I was 15 or 16. Similar. I saw Fargo in high school, kind of similar situation where at the time I just didn't like it. And I, upon rewatch, really liked it later. And so I watched Little Miss Sunshine for the first time. And since it came out, and I had a much better appreciation for the dark humor, the kind of absurd family dynamics, particularly, Alan Arkin as the grandfather, Paul Dano as the brother. And I absolutely loved the ending. So Little Miss Sunshine, I know a lot of people have seen that film, but it's a film, again, that I saw early when it came out and wasn't a huge fan of it as a, preteen or early teenager. But, now almost 30 years old, I have a much more appreciation for this film. So yeah, Little Miss Sunshine, really enjoyed watching that again this time around for the first time in a long time. Next film I want to talk about that I've watched this month is one of my favorite films of all time, and that is 2005's Kingdom of Heaven from Ridley Scott. This is a film that when it first came out got pretty mixed to negative reviews, and within a year Ridley Scott released a director's cut. The director's cut for this film is the only one I recommend watching. It is considered one of the most definitive director's cut of any film ever made, to the point where literally an hour was removed from this film and pretty much gutted the theatrical cut. The hour that is added back is incredibly significant to the story and the characters, character development. It's kind of crazy that they allowed the original version that was released in theaters to ever see the light of day. But at the time, Fox didn't believe that people would want to see a 3-hour historical epic film. And I think the director's cut is one of the greatest films ever made. I absolutely adore it. I would try to watch it to, at least once every couple of years. So if you've never seen Kingdom of Heaven, the director's cut, definitely got to check it out. The next two films I'm not going to talk really about because I'm going to talk about them with a couple guests very soon here. Man of Steel and Batman versus Superman. I rewatched both of those recently in order to watch Zack Snyder's Justice League. So all three of those films in the DC universe in general, I will be discussing on my podcast in the next couple days. So I will have an episode out with my thoughts on all of those very soon. And then same thing with the next few films here. 2014's Godzilla, 2017's Kong Skull Island, and 2019's Godzilla King of Monsters, along with Godzilla versus Kong. All four of those films I will be discussing my thoughts on a podcast episode probably next week with a guest. So look forward to those very, very soon here. Before I wrap things up, the last thing I want to talk about is the challenge that I am going to be working on over the next couple of years. My goal is to, if you are watching on YouTube right now, you will be able to see the book I'm holding up, 1001 Movies You Must See Before You Die. This is the 2015 edition. I've had it for a couple of years now, and I'd like to finally challenge myself to work my way through it, watch every single film. And I started it today. So the first two films in the 2015 edition are a 14-minute film from 1902 and a 12-minute film from 1903. Both of them are almost 120 years old, so they're in the public domain. So both of these, technically they're short films. At the time they were considered feature-length films, but they are in the public domain, so you can watch them for free. The Library of Congress has posted both of them, I believe, on YouTube. And then A Trip to the Moon is the first one, 1902. A Trip to the Moon is also available on YouTube or on Amazon Prime. You can rent it for like 99 cents. So A Trip to the Moon is basically a 14-minute short film that was made in France, and it's a early science fiction film. It's kind of amazing what they were able to accomplish in 1902, but it's not really a film that I would go out of my way to watch over and over again. But it's something that you got to appreciate and admire, what the film accomplished for what it was and its place in early cinema and its influences. The next one in the book, in 1001 Movies You Must See Before You Die, the very next film is from the very next year, 1903. It's called The Great Train Robbery, which also you should be able to find on YouTube. It's in the public domain. You can watch it for free. It's only 12 minutes. And it's basically a silent Western film, train robbery. American made and often considered a landmark film in American cinema. Early American cinema, early 20th century, obviously precedes, all the great Western films that would come decades later, and often is contributed or attributed or people attribute it as the major influence for a lot of those films. But similarly to A Trip to the Moon, not something I love, but I do appreciate its place in cinema history of film, and it's worth watching one time. Both of them are, if you've never seen them. So I'm excited to do this challenge, and I'm going to continue to do it every month. And this project, this series, I'm going to do every month as well, where I will talk about every film I watched. If you listened all the way through, thank you for taking the time to listen on my thoughts on some of the movies and TV shows I watched in March. Check back at the end of next month. I plan on making this a monthly series talking about the things that talking about my thoughts on movies and TV shows that I've been watching each month. Because as I said in the beginning, I don't think I'm going to do much of the written stuff anymore. So if you're someone who's enjoyed my written stuff, hopefully you'll listen along when I post these once a month. And like I mentioned, I am going to still continue discussions on some new films. Got a couple coming up here on Zack Snyder's Justice League and Kong versus Godzilla, Godzilla versus Kong. And then I will be starting another new series here very soon. I'm hoping with a game that I have some people set up to do. So thanks for listening. I'm Vince. This is the Film Nerd Podcast. I'll be back very soon with another episode and some guests. Until next time, go watch some movies.